Hi, everybody. This is Nick from Our Digital Symposium. I just want to say this is our first ever episode recording, and I hope that the audio isn't too bad. We're working to make this better, so if you have any suggestions, leave it in the comments. Without further ado, here's the podcast. Hi, everybody. This is Our Digital Symposium. I'm your host, Nick Grunig, and my co host here is Curtis. Curtis, I'd like you to introduce yourself as this is our first episode, and we'll get to the discussion on the topic today, which is the Matrix theory. Do we live in the Matrix?
Okay. Hi, my name is Curtis Humphreys. Short thing about me, I'm a 22-year-old adult male, I guess, in Idaho, and I've grown up in Idaho my whole life. And the way I'm related to Nick is he is my cousin. He was born on my first birthday. We've been close ever since we were young. And one of the reasons we started talking and talking about doing this podcast type thing is because me and him are kind of opposed on some ideas, but we really just like talking about thought processes and cool theories and whatnot, kind of nerdy like that. And we're going to have these conversations anyways, so we thought we might as well record them and have somebody else chime in.
Yeah. So, we obviously wanted to make this like a more of an average person podcast, and I think that's great because I'm not getting any kind of special education. I'm just going to Idaho State University, which is like an average college and university. As well as, yeah, we're cousins. And what's really funny about this episode, I think this comes like very round, it comes around essentially because one of the very first movies I remember us really bonding over when we were like 6 or 7 years old was The Matrix. And so I think that's what makes it really cool that this is going to be our first ever episode of Our Digital Symposium, because that's where we all started. That's kind of where I started my philosophical train of thought. I think that's probably the first philosophical thought I ever had, actually, was do we live in the Matrix? Right?
I think it probably was us jumping around on the trampoline and talking about, man, do we live in the Matrix? Us little 7-year-olds, 7 and
Yeah, I wanted to talk about what the Matrix theory is, and then we're gonna get into some discussion of any remarks of like differences in a simulation theory, as well as some like, personal examples that we've seen, and talking about whether or not we believe we live in the Matrix. And so I guess I'll put this premise in there first, and that's we don't necessarily always like expound or talk about our own beliefs, not every time. If we flag it as our beliefs, chances are it is, but I think we're just here to have a pretty good discussion and just see where each topic goes, instead of just trying to make any kind of argument for our agenda or for like who we are.
Yeah, we don't have like a belief system or an agenda we're trying to push. Like, if anything, we're more interested in what other people have to say. Because, like I said in my introduction, me and Nick are going to have these conversations anyways, whether we're talking online, whether we're in person, or we're playing video games together. We're going to have this conversation. So it's kind of cool that we get to put it on YouTube and that maybe somebody will have something that they want to say. And maybe that'll change
Yeah,
our
we'd love to
minds.
see any kind of conversation in the comments. And also, I think the only agenda we might be pushing is that we want civil conversation, and we want people to find foundations of agreement, even though they can disagree on a lot of different things. I think that's where we're going to start this episode, and the episode I wanted to title it something along the lines of "Do we live in the Matrix?" And I guess in order to say whether or not we do, let's define like what that is. And so I actually want to go through a couple different interpretations. A couple of them are more modern philosophical questions, and actually the first one comes from Descartes, the first question of our own existence. Obviously he came with the cogito ergo sum, which is I think therefore I am, which essentially was questioning his own existence and whether or not he existed. And the conclusion of Descartes there was just this: I'm a thinking thing. I'm thinking and I'm questioning my own existence, and because I'm doing that questioning, I therefore exist somewhere.
I think, therefore I am.
And I find this interesting because Descartes, although he builds up a lot of different theories beyond this, and like most philosophers don't accept those theories, this basic theory still sticks with everyone. And my caveat to it is, how do we know if we're like biological things versus the technological or the silicone-esque things, much like a computer motherboard, right? What if we're just an electrical impulse is kind of the question I have as well. So I guess, is there any comments on that before I move on to more modern interpretations of this questioning of existence?
No, but I mean, other than if you don't really know who Descartes is what we're pretty much talking about is the exact movie Matrix, how Morpheus has to go to Neo and say, yeah, man, this whole thing is a lie, and we can take you out of this and show you the real world. So what we're talking about is, are we in the world that Neo was in before he took the red pill? Like in any shape. So whether it's motherboard or it's we're actually like hooked into some technological machine sapping us for power, like
Yeah.
anything like that.
All right. So there's two more interpretations of this, like, of the argument that's been happening since the 1900s, for like this idea of simulation. And the first one that I've been talked about a few times by like philosophy teachers is this brain in the vat scenario. So the brain in the vat is essentially this argument of, how do you know that you weren't abducted last night and like aliens harvested your brain and put you in this vat, in this essentially like this like water, and given electrical impulses to believe that you're still alive, still on Earth, doing what you would have if you weren't abducted, is essentially that argument there. I don't really find that argument very good, personally. It's like a very, very highly improbable one, mainly because it's like although I do believe in some intelligent life somewhere, I don't know if that intelligent life is necessarily like messing with humans, especially to harvest their brain. But that's like essentially that was like the question of, how do you prove your own reality is true, in the materialist world. This materialist world is true. Conversation doesn't end there too. We'll go into John Baudrillard more in our next episode, actually, where we talk about his specific theories and on how it's a portrayal of media. However, The Matrix itself, the movie The Matrix, is based off of John Baudrillard's theories of our simulated realities, which he thought of as our media portrayals as simulated realities, but the Wachowski siblings brought it in as a physical difference in reality. And so that's why I want to go into the last argument, which I think is actually like the intertwined one with The Matrix, which is Nick Bostrom's theory, who's actually University of Oxford philosopher, who said in 2003 when that essentially that there's going to become a point where the society grows to a level where virtual reality will be indistinguishable from reality. And I think we're not there yet, but we are on the verge of that in the next 100 to 200 years even, right? I would say. And so it's because like VR is getting better. It looks decent now, but like it could be way better. He says that there's only a few scenarios that happen. Is one, we reach that technological advance and we say that's bad and we outlaw it. Or two, we die. We all die as a human race before we reach that technology, or we restart our civilization or something. Or three, we do get this technology good enough and we use it. And he says that's the most likely scenario. And then he tells us like, imagine how many simulated people there are then at that point. Like essentially everyone has their own virtual world, much like a video game world where it's like you have millions of different characters. Every person has a multiplier of millions of people that are simulated, that are false, right? And that's the argument he makes, is that you are more than likely the simulated person from that virtual reality game, essentially, than you would be in real life. It's the most likely scenario. And that scares me a little bit. It's because like I don't know if he's wrong there.
Yeah, I mean, like, the whole scenario is almost like you can't disprove it, because if we are in a simulation and it is such an advanced technology that we can feel pain and sadness even though we're not real, like, there's almost no way for us to find out if it's real. None that I've heard of, at least.
Yeah, I think the only way we can kind of know it's real, I guess, is dying and being pulled out of the simulation, right? I think at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Like, it reminds me of Rick and Morty.
Man, what a gamble! What a gamble!
Right?
That
We should just both kill
Oh my
ourselves now so we can
gosh.
find out, right?
Let's do it, man. Let's hope we get
Dude,
reincarnated.
I want to be reincarnated as like a fish or something.
I want to be reincarnated as an elf. By the way, that might be a reoccurring
Yeah,
theme. I want to be
he loves
reincarnated as
elves.
an elf.
I'm indifferent. Elves are pretty cool. I guess they live a long time. They're smart, so it's pretty good. But yeah, I think it reminds me of Rick and Morty, honestly. Did you see that episode of like...
Oh, it does.
What is it?
Totally, yeah.
It's like Roy, I think it's the game's what it's called.
Yeah, you play as a guy named Roy or something
You go
like
through
that.
the whole life.
And it's you living out his whole life. And of course, Rick goes off the grid and scores tons of points and all stuff like that. Whereas Morty goes in, lives like an average life, and has some kids that don't like him, and also works at a rug store. And then he dies by a bunch of rugs falling on him or something.
It's like he had cancer, he beat cancer and went back to the rug store, and then the rug store killed him. And then then Rick was like, yeah, you really shouldn't have went back to that rug store the second time after you beat cancer. I just think it's
like, yeah, man, come on. This game's not that hard. Like, what? Right? How am I supposed to know that?
And it's interesting to me because that's almost too real, because if you think about like how Morty reacts to it, he's so confused because he's been in someone else's consciousness, this fake consciousness, for a whole lifetime. And it's almost like it's weird, because I wonder if that's how it'll happen for us too, where much like if we like some people, when they're so obsessed with celebrities that they'll think they're the celebrities. That's a real mental disease.
They like live
yeah,
vicariously.
And they'll literally think they are them too.
They try to become them.
And the same thing like crazy people, like, it reminds me of the on every levels except physical, I am a wolf guy from Vine. You know that?
Oh,
it reminds me of that kind of thing too, like where it's essentially like, I don't know if it's that uncommon for people to like see be drenched in something and then like almost convince their own consciousness down that they are that thing. So it's like almost like, even if we knew going in that we were going into a simulation, maybe we just forgot about it. Even.
Or maybe the simulation makes it so you don't
know?
Maybe you only know about it when you enter the simulation when you're a baby, but you can't talk about it. And because you live so long as a baby before you can really start functioning.
Maybe you lose your language.
Like the yeah, and so you kind of like lose what your train of thought was before you entered as the baby. And then you forget about it.
There's an interesting theory. At least I know one of my like philosophy like friends and a professor, that essentially that we can only think in the form of our language we already know. Essentially, like we can be introduced to new experiences that thus change our interpretation of like how languages work. But essentially, if we don't speak a language and we don't know how to construct realities in that specific reality, or construct a coherent narrative in that reality, we lose the ideas. We can't have those ideas. And so that might actually be like why we can't communicate that, because we can't even communicate it to ourselves. We lose the mechanism of thinking about it in this world, essentially.
Yeah, man, and it completely explains why we have a declining birth rate, is because people are figuring out this simulation game is shit.
We are a bad game of Sims. I can't remember what song said that, but it was a song. That's it. Yeah, it is Bo Burnham.
It's Bo Burnham's. Yeah. God doesn't love you. You're just a bad game of
actually,
Sims.
I guess we should then move on to the question. Like a burning question is like, do we believe this theory? That's true.
You see, I think that this question and this theory can drive someone to suicide. So I want to be
Uh-huh.
careful because I think it's a really dumb reason to kill yourself. I think that you can know or think that this is real and still go, well, this is all I have right now, though, so I'm still going to live my best life, right? So you could be nihilistic and go, well, this isn't really real, and I'm going to wake up and it's really going to be 30 seconds of my life that I spent playing a crap game, right? But it's like, yeah, but still, like, this is all you have right now, so you should just do your best to make it good. But don't get so entrenched. So just don't get so entrenched in the fact that we might actually be in a simulation and that you can't really disprove it without killing yourself. Um, so that you don't actually
Yeah.
kill yourself. Like that's not a good thing. Don't do that. Um, this is it might be real. Like we don't I can't disprove it. But so I kind of think, well, yeah, maybe. You see like deja vu, and it's like the game just had a glitch or whatever, right? Like you kind of just think like that. Um, but that doesn't mean that it's not worthwhile, I guess.
So I guess yeah, that the preface of yeah, don't decide to do that anyways. I guess it's to me it's like almost a question of Pascal's wager, but like for this specific scenario where like although yes you could find out the information by killing yourself now, it's not worth it if it's not true. It's not worth the risk, right? Because I think even us who are entertaining this thought, at least personally, I think it's probably a 99% chance it's this is the real world and about a 1% chance that this is a simulation. But I can't get rid of that chance. I can't know for sure, and that's a problem. It's not
Sure.
like Descartes cogito ergo sum, because he knows for sure that there's some existence of him somewhere, versus we're trying to see what existence that is. So it's almost like we should yeah, we should treat this life like it's a real, because I think the philosophy doesn't change. Like a personal philosophy doesn't change by knowing you're in a simulation, because you're still experiencing this as your consciousness. It's not like your consciousness is gone at this point. But like, if you want a good experience, you should have a good experience about it. I think still. So I guess what's your take on percentage chance this is fake or real?
It's probably around the same 99% real, 1% simulation. Because, like I said, if you get too far into that, then it's just well, I'm going to show this person, whoever put me in the simulation, like I don't care enough. I'll see if it's real right now, right? And you just might decide to do the one thing you can't take back. And I just so it's like, yeah, you kind of see things, like you see some stuff happen and you go, like Donald Trump becoming president. Yeah, this is a simulation. Why would a reality TV star become president? Like you just kind of it's okay to joke about that and kind of think, well, there's maybe a chance that we are. But
Mhm.
like I just don't think it's healthy to think that, yeah, man, this is actual the Matrix, and some sooner or later a Morpheus type character is going to come and give me a choice of pills.
Yeah, it sounds
Like
like a bad LSD trip, right?
just live this out. Bad LSD trip, and I've seen some
Yeah,
bad
it actually
LSD
reminds me.
trips.
So I was listening to a podcast, and it's from Vox, and Ezra Klein does a podcast, and essentially it was an episode on like someone talking about consciousness and how LSD and other like psychoactives have like warped people's perception of self and like their ego, and how it's like kind of made them at times was it disillusion from their
Disillusioned.
own ego, right? And essentially now
Mm.
like they don't care about themselves anymore at that point, and I think that's a very unhealthy thing to do. But I do want to say that I think just because it's unhealthy doesn't mean we shouldn't explore the truth statement of it still.
Oh, for
So
sure, for sure. But I'm just saying, there's got to be a degree to that.
yeah,
Like you shouldn't spend your whole life trying to prove whether or not we're
well, I
in a
think
simulation.
it's
That there's
there's no
probably no
chance of us
chance of
proving
you're
it,
trying
right?
to
Yeah,
disprove.
and I think
Yeah, so it's like don't obsess over it. But yeah, you can ponder it and think about it as
mm,
much as you want, but just don't get into the fact that don't think of it as pure fact, because
and
then you start
here's
throwing other
here's what
things
my
out of the
philosophy
window.
was, and I kind of when I first ran into this question a few years ago when I was barely like going into college with no philosophical background really, that I found a different philosophy to help me out with that question. So I said, regardless of the answer to the Matrix question, if we're in a simulation, I can still have the same answer morally, or the same answer to not kill myself, which is based on Albert Camus and absurdism. So you see on the right side of this of the video. All right, this is just a picture that we're going to be running, so you can listen to the audio. But if you look at the video on the right corner, there is a picture of Sisyphus right there, where he's the person that was punished for eternity to push a boulder up the hill, and then it would just fall back down once he got to the top, and he had to do that for eternity because he disobeyed Zeus. And what Albert Camus tells you is that he is actually you should look at him as an absurd hero, because no one said anything about him having to not enjoy his boulder pushing for eternity. And this is Albert Camus writing this in response to World War II tragedies of like Nazi Germany and internment camps. Essentially, it's the argument that regardless of how bad your scenario is, even if it's the best life ever, or you are literally a Jew in a concentration camp, you can still try to make the best out of your own scenario. And I think that's... Yeah, you should still try to make, not only be the best at what you can do, but also have a smile on your faces, or at least have as good of an attitude as you can in that specific scenario. And so, and it's not justifying any action by the other or by life itself being bad, but by having a good, let's say a better like framing of what you're supposed to do in regardless of the scenario you're in, helps deal with depression actually. So I recommend anyone who wants to help deal with depression, go learn from the existentialists, especially Camus. The Myth of Sisyphus is a good read, or you can look at a different podcast and find one on it too. For example, I'll probably reference Philosophize This a lot because that's what helped me learn philosophy really easily actually. Yeah, way too much. So I guess I do want to move on to a conversation about what evidence do we see for us believing it's 99% reality then versus 1% matrix theory? Do you have any specifics you want to talk about?
I think it's more of a general optimism. For me, it's more like, I really hope this is real life, because like everybody struggles with depression, but it's like if I'm 99%, it's way better than 98%. Really, like that extra 1% might help you when you're in a really low spot. Because maybe when next time you're in a really low spot, you go, oh well, this isn't real anyways, so I'm just gonna leave. This is a bad game. Like, this is bad. Yeah, I might just rage quit life, and I don't want to think that way personally. Like, that and the encounters that I have in real life where I go, this doesn't seem real, are very small. Like, other than when I go to Walmart, there's a Walmart across my house. It's like every day that I go to Walmart, there's something in there that I go, oh god. No, I'm kidding. It's not that bad.
God.
In Boise, Idaho, it's not that bad.
Yeah, it's kind of funny to see like how people dress and how people act in the Walmarts. Yeah. Yeah. I guess to me, there's a sense of like this is reality because of how our brain function and our brain structure, like how we see the world can change significantly based on how our mood is as well. And I think that's something important that's I don't know, like I guess it's me being optimistic again, saying as well, saying well, if we have all these mood swings and these changes in how we act, it can't be simulation, because the stimuli seems so real. Essentially, like the depression or the happiness seems so real, as well as like the alcohol or like the food seems so real.
I guess one of the things that also that I think is that if this is a simulation in the sense of like the Rick and Morty game per se, this is a really boring simulation. You know what I mean? Like, we can't fly. I don't have magical powers, no superpowers. Like all we have are the Avengers. Like, that's the closest thing to superpowers we have is 3D Avengers, and I hate 3D movies. So this is it's just to think that a simulation would be this boring is I don't know, I guess would make it even more depressing. It would make it depressing that we are in a simulation that's a bit
Uh,
boring. So it's like, well, no, this is just real life. This is what we do, rather than think this is just a simulation and it just sucks.
that reminds me of Bandersnatch. I know you haven't seen it yet. Because you said though you don't really like watching Black Mirror very often, that you'd watch that episode with me when you come down here in the summer again. But
I would.
I'll tell you one part of it because it doesn't spoil anything. But essentially, it's like
Go ahead.
when your character that you're choosing for finally says like, I think I'm being controlled by someone else, because that's part of the story. And the therapist says, well, this is a really boring like game if you are getting controlled by someone else. And then your response is, you only have two responses, which is yeah and fuck yeah. and both lead to like the therapist pulling out like weapons essentially to fight you. And that's the only thing I'll kind of like tell you about, because the ending choices are so cool based on every choice you make beyond that one, pretty much, except for the first couple that don't really matter. But essentially, like, that's the same line of thought that the therapist has, and then it turns into that kind of like video game fight scene at that point. It's kind of funny.
I don't know, because it's like, yeah, you gotta get a 9 to 5, you gotta pay taxes. It's like, what kind of simulation is this? There's no elves anywhere. See, I told you I was gonna get back to that joke, but like, there's no mythical beasts, there's no challenges. I mean, like, God, if this is a simulation, the simulational RPG games are better than the actual simulation. Shout out to Witcher 3.
And it's kind of funny though, if you think about it too, though. It's like we've created this game to be a simulation in real life almost, but like with different ends of it. And that's why like I think I love D&D so much, even though I've only played it twice ever, is that you essentially, it's all based on your imagination if you play the normal board game. Because like you're creating new characters and you're creating the scene, like your dungeon master's creating a scene, and it's usually like poorly drawn, but you kind of picture the scene and the monster that you fight, because usually there's a boss like fight at the end. And it's like all of our imagination is like put into that, and that's our form of like simulation. And I guess the same for RPG games that are much like D&D style. Except it's just a little less open, because it's, D&D is just kind of like a conversation you're having, making a story, versus code, like video game coding. And so, but either way, it's kind of funny, because we could be in a simulation now and create better simulations because of how bored we are in this one too, which is kind of funny. And I know we've talked about this before, but obviously not on the podcast. You said that if we do find a way to make a simulation, like a virtual reality, as good as real life, and be able to essentially convince our own mind that virtual reality is real life, that you'd be willing to jump in if you could make yourself like an elf, for example, right?
Oh yeah, like if I could have magical powers that were be an elf or something mythical and fight beasts like that, like, yeah, dude, this world is not nearly interesting enough to stick around. And I think that's one of the problems. It's like, is that if once we get to that level where the real world, or that the virtual world is as real as the real world, like sense-wise, so sight, touch, feel, taste, smell, all those. Then like, what would be the reason to stay in the reality we're in?
I don't think there is one beyond the argument of like God, right?
That's the thing, though. Like that, and in an age where religion is not nearly as followed as it used to be. Like, I fear that if that were to happen in, say, the next 10 years, that there's going to be a bunch of kids that are younger than me that just go, screw it, I'm done. And they're just going to hop in their world, and they're going to have a bunch of fun, and then they're going to starve to death, and they won't care because they won't feel it.
I wonder if that'll change like the role of like government, for example, like, because like it's almost like you could change
Gosh, yeah.
the Matrix. So in the Matrix, the main antagonist are the robots throughout, like the machines is what they're called throughout. It's almost like
Uh-huh.
that could be a voluntary action of us being in this goo and getting fed by like a tube because we just choose the simulation instead, and the government becomes the machines at that point, right? Where it's like,
Yeah, except in the Matrix, it's like they
yeah,
make
that's fair.
babies and then immediately put the babies in the tubes. Like
It's not
it's not like they
consented.
get the babies get
Yeah,
to
I
choose.
guess that's the key
Yeah,
difference.
consensual. The consent is
Yeah,
the major
we've already talked
key.
about multiple different issues where, at the end of the day, it is consent
Consent
is
is
the thing
key.
that matters the most. Like
Uh,
in any economic system as well as any social system, consent, I
mhm,
guess, is has always been the key for us.
mhm. But not to sound too weebish, but there's an anime that's like one of the most popular ones called Sword Art Online, and it talks about that. It's a virtual reality where you get like RPG style video game powers, but then you get locked in it by the dude who made it. And if you don't complete the game, then he
Oh
kills you.
shit!
Like, 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 why couldn't that happen? Why couldn't I mean, you know? I think that the farther we go into the VR stuff, the cooler it gets, no doubt. But also the scarier the
Yeah, because
possibilities.
if we're essentially dissolute from society at that point, and we're focused solely on
Mm-hmm.
like this new form of society that that's constructed in a just on a screen basically, right? And so I think at that point, like,
Mm-hmm.
like if everyone wants to do that and people want to like make money off of that, but I don't know the reason why if everyone literally wanted to do that, that any like I guess I guess what I'm trying to like comprehend is like this world where everyone chooses to live in a simulation would have to be like completely self-sustaining, and like almost an AI would have to run the any kind of repairs to the system, right? For all of us to
Mm-hmm.
enjoy the simulation, or some people aren't going to be able to enjoy that simulation. um Actually, this reminds me.
Or they'll just go screw those people.
That's fair.
That's the thing. Like you can give a bunch of power to people who make the game that you're living in, the simulation you're living in. It's like they're the god of
Yeah,
your universe. As soon as you put on their
for
thing,
sure.
right?
So here's interesting. I just again, I love Black Mirror, much like Philosophize This. I'll reference Black Mirror a lot, but one of the episodes of Black
Mm-hmm.
Mirror is about the afterlife and essentially having a silicone construction of the afterlife, i.e., it is a virtual construction of the afterlife in a motherboard. So
What's this one called again? There's this one
I
I
think
watched with you.
so. It's like those two girls that were like way older, right?
Ah.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
spoil too
Okay.
much, but essentially to the people who haven't seen it, but essentially it's, and if you're watching this podcast and you're not watching Black Mirror, like you're committing cognitive dissidence at this point, right?
So am I. I've only watched like 3
God
episodes.
damn it!
Don't worry about
But anyways, they copied their consciousness and put it onto basically the cloud, and they live in a simulated reality and they choose to make that decision once their bodies are not good enough to live, right? Like once they're about to die, like they're dying in the next couple months or a year or whatever, and they can essentially schedule themselves to be put into that simulated world, and then their body to be like put down at that point. Right, because their consciousness goes into the
Mm-hmm.
simulated reality at that point. um but obviously there's some ethical questions about like, is that actually yourself or is that just a carbon copy of yourself, and what does that mean? Like, do you
Mm-hmm.
actually survive, or is it a new version of you that you've convinced yourself that you're you? um but that's almost like one of the questions, and throughout, and in that episode specifically, that essentially killed off religion because people had a guaranteed afterlife they could test before they even die, versus having to have this leap of faith. And to me, it's way too big of a leap of faith to believe, and to change my every action in my life around it, um just for an eternal afterlife. When like and if I had that choice to be downloaded into a consciousness and be able to choose when I want to leave it, if I do, I would easily choose that over religion, even though I'm not religious now.
Yeah, I mean, the whole God concept ends if you, in my opinion, if you believe that we're in a simulation, because something created that isn't an all-powerful being, more than likely.
Yes, but it's
right. Like if we're in the Matrix, then it's like some humans probably made the simulation a long time ago, and then the AI machines just developed it.
I don't
into
know
what
if
it
that
is
completely
now.
gets rid of God, but it does have to change your perspective of a lot of like Christian and Muslim gods, to not be the perfect being. It just essentially God just has to be at least some like barely smarter than us to create the simulation and control it, right?
Yeah. Well, so what I meant in that was
Okay,
the
yeah.
all-powerful God. That is in a Christian religions, Jewish religion, and the
Mhm.
Muslim religion. So, because I don't think that the machines in the Matrix were all powerful, considering they lost or had a tie at the end
When
of the
they
third
lost
one.
to themselves, basically. They lost. I mean, if you
Yeah,
think
kind
about
of,
it, this
yeah.
whole story, Matrix trilogy, if you haven't seen it by now and you clicked on this episode, then like,
What are
spoilers.
you doing? Why aren't you watching it? It's one of the greatest trilogies
Yes.
of movie history.
Underrated. You can
Watch
skip
it.
the second one. Right?
What? You can't
mean, you
skip
can
the
kind-
second one. The second one's got the
Okay, it's
best
got
fight
great fight
scenes.
scenes, but like the story is more incoherent in that one for sure.
And it is, but it also has a very good French character.
Okay.
I drink too much wine. I must take a piece.
That's funny.
Those who've watched The Matrix a bunch of times know
Yeah.
exactly what I'm talking about.
So, I guess this is like, shoot, what was I saying now? This is a spoiler to that, but like the spoiler to the ending of the third one, which is that they have essentially there's a figure which is the god of the machines, basically, and that god, I would say the mothership of the consciousness of the robots, the AI robots, yeah,
Head AI guy.
basically is God.
Almost literally.
It's pretty literally at the end, actually. And then there's there's essentially this fallen angel in Agent Smith throughout the whole trilogy, and that's actually the like what it to me it's very biblical in that sense, where it's Agent Smith falls out of being an agent, and which is very close to an angel, and I would say it has the same duties of an angel, of like essentially keeping the peace and
making sure
essentially making sure God's programs work, right, at that point. But it's much like making sure that heaven is actually heaven. And then cast away and decides to say that humans aren't valuable and screw humans, much like Satan did as well, or Lucifer at the time, and was cast away, thrown away, and then it's him essentially trying to kill God at that point.
Well, that's also his realization, kind of at the end, where it's like,
yeah, because like he killed the most powerful person in the movie, which is like Keanu Reeves, and Neo represents like this idea of like humans outbeating Satan. I think this is a biblical paradigm of this. Obviously I have different ones because I'm not a very religious person, but if I were to take the biblical story, which I think this is based off of a bit, and it's saying that humans beat Satan and that therefore like are to God, but Satan actually wins in this instance in the first place, and then God intervenes and essentially tells them, hey, by the way, you're alive again. You're saved.
Well, I mean, it's also like the whole Jesus dying for our sins. So yeah, so he dies and he kind of loses, but it's also like I'm dying for everybody
and at the end,
else.
obviously, he dies,
so that they can have the choice.
But to me, it's like that.
By the way, Keanu Reeves' character dies at the end of the.
Yeah, I gave him a spoiler.
He dies.
And that movie came out like 20 years ago, so. Yeah.
Almost,
yeah.
Great movies though. Flip phones and everything.
So I think there's it's the same story in Christianity too, of like Jesus represents all humans as well, of like essentially die, like they're like they die and then they're forgiven by God. Like, to me, that's what like the real story of Christianity is like the judgment day of everyone, where they're tempted by many of Satan's things, i.e., immoral things or whatever, and then they're eventually forgiven by God if they're willing to forgive, like, or if they're willing to like be like give into the system, which is essentially what Neo does, is like give into the machine system again after being out of the machine system, and then obviously he gets revived to win. But yeah, it's a convoluted biblical story as well as a story of like living in a simulation.
Yep, but it is
Really good.
a great set of movies, and if you haven't watched them, what?
By the way, this is sponsored by the Wachowski siblings. I'm just kidding. Obviously, it's not.
Keanu Reeves gave me money to walk his dog once, and so now I'm making this.
No, I've never met.
Yeah, I'd love to someday. Yeah,
Birdie's a great guy though, so maybe you'd like to.
I know there's a couple of philosophy quotes
because he does watch our.
So maybe I'll at him when I post this video and be like, "Hey,
Yeah,
philosophy
maybe.
talking about the Matrix.
Maybe we.
Come watch." Even. Yeah.
That'd be funny. Might as well try. He's a good guy. He probably would just lie though and say, "Yeah, I watched it, guys."
He wouldn't even respond. Come on.
We're gonna be. By the way, one of the guys in there said you were gonna lie and say that you did watch it.
It'd be hilarious if that happened.
That'd be a simulation
Right?
moment right there.
Anyways, I think we went on a really like a really weird train of thought, and I guess I'll pull it in a little bit. I think there's obviously with this conversation, like this branch of conversation started with, do we believe we're in the Matrix, right? And like, what's our evidence for it? Yeah, in a simulation. What's our evidence for it? And we said it's probably not true. And then we went on a big tangent of what if it was true, I guess. And then we just started like taking 10 minutes to talk about how cool Matrix is, basically. But it is.
Which, like, you can't title it The Matrix without
That's
talking about
fair.
how good the series is.
That's fair.
Blasphemous. That was like my religion as a little kid. I used to watch that on trips all the time. We'd take all 3 of those movies and watch all 3 of them on car
I have
trips,
them on.
just
I have them on
over and over and over
iTunes.
again. That and The Knight's Tale. Another
That's
great
a
movie.
that's a very
Rip
good
Heath
movie.
Ledger.
Yeah, Heath Ledger's really good in that too.
And then we talked to some about like the nihilistic look at this whole simulation thing and how that can bring you to do some pretty bad stuff. And how we both believe that you should, even if you do believe that we're in a simulation, you should go with the absurdist view, which is just, well, this is all you have. You should just live your life the way you want to. And then, yeah, we talked about Keanu Reeves.
And his dog.
Matrix.
And his dog, right?
Yeah, I said I walked his dog. I didn't walk his dog. I didn't
Yeah.
touch his dog. I don't want to be in the next movie.
Yeah, the John Wick movies. Those are really good too, actually. I think we're done with this episode. Yeah,
What an ending.
Like we just started talking about how the Matrix was really cool. I guess I didn't think the conversation was gonna stop there, but I think it's hard to. I think it's really hard to prove like one way or another, because I think we both believe that there's evidence for both sides, but a majority of the evidence sides with us being in real life.
And the one for sure way to find out if we're in a simulation or not is
And
to kill
don't
yourself.
do it.
And that's a
That's a no from
we're
me,
not
Chief.
advocating for this. Yeah, Simon Cowell. That's a no from me. This is not it. I think that's all I have to say about the subject. The simulation may or may not be real, but just try to live your best life through it. And watch the Matrix
and watch
movies.
Black Mirror, right, Curtis?
Like,
Uh,
I'm not watching the pilot. I'm not. Those who've watched it know exactly what
You
I'm
don't need
talking
to watch
about.
the
I'm not
pilot.
watching that. I'm not watching that. My mom watched that whole series. She's like, "Why do I have to watch the pilot?" I was like, "I
Yeah,
told you,
I know.
you didn't have to."
That's what I tell everyone when they want to watch, like, because like I'm like, hey, this is a really good philosophical, like, and a high tech, like a sci-fi oriented show, and I'm like, by the way, you can skip the pilot. It's nothing like the rest of the show. Which is really weird.
Yeah.
'Cause I don't know, because it's like, I guess it was a bit low budget, but it wasn't actually that low budget, like the pilot. So I'm wondering if they just had had an idea for their pilot, and they're like, well, this, or like they had a bunch of ideas, and they're like, let's take the one that's going to like shock the most people, but's not as good as the rest of them. Is how I felt like that episode was.
I guess, yeah, maybe to draw like some
Yeah.
appeal, but yeah, I mean,
Okay, so I think we're done
we're
here.
pretty much done here.
And we wanted to have this conversation because again, this was our first ever like real philosophical thought, I would say, as well as I think it branches off into more discussions. So we're going to talk about John Baudrillard a lot more next time in media and how media interacts with our lives. And that in that episode, we'll actually talk about. I know we'll talk about, is it Nick Sandman or something like that in the Covington High School situation, as well as a bunch of other things. But that's it for this week. That'll come next week. So look on your feeds there. If you want to join our conversations, either in the comments or you can do it on our Discord. It's going to be linked in the description, as well as our channel. As well as I at least interact with Twitter. And if you want to send me tweets in discussions or possible episodes, well, go ahead and do that. That's fine. And my Twitter will be linked in the description as well.
I may or may not be setting up a Minds account sooner or later. It is
All
what
right,
it
well,
is,
that's
man.
going to do it this week.
The simulation
But I
deems
guess-
it that way.
I guess we both think we're not in a simulation, probably. But hey, if we are like host people, can we get pulled out for a minute and just like let us see the real world?
Yeah, or just like turn me into an elf. Come on.
It's like, yeah, can I not be limited to like jumping a couple feet in the air and stuff like that? Give me. I want to be double. I want to double jump. I want to be like a cyborg ninja.
Lord of the Rings, Legolas.
Again, that's gonna do it for us. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.